Hi, everybody. We have Vidya Ananthakrishna, who is the Director of Youth Justice Initiatives at the Columbia University Justice Lab. In her role, she oversees the lab's work to end the use of youth prisons in America and to develop a community-centered approach to justice. Central to her work is the convening of the Youth Correctional Leaders for Justice, a group of current and former youth justice administrators who are publicly calling for the end of youth prisons and will serve as a resource to the field as states and localities look to reimagine their systems. Prior to joining the lab, Vidya worked at the Vera Institute for Justice for a decade, managing and directing an array of projects to keep youth out of the justice system. Her portfolio included work on local and state reform efforts in New York, including staffing Governor Patterson's task force on transforming juvenile justice, as well as directing 2 multi-year initiatives focused on status offenses and youth employment. We're also joined today by Mishi Faruqi, who's the National Field Director of the Youth First Initiative. In her capacity at Youth First, Mishi supports the state-based campaigns by providing technical assistance, training, and strategy support. Previously, she worked for as the Juvenile Justice Policy Strategist for the National ACLU and as the Campaign Director at the Washington State ACLU. She's led several advocacy coalitions and campaigns with the Correctional Association of New York, first as the director of the Women in Prison Project and later as the director of Juvenile Justice Project. And she's also worked as the director of youth justice programs at the Children's Defense Fund in New York. Mishi was also the senior advisor to the commissioner of the New York City's Department of Probation, where she was involved in planning New York City's Close to Home initiative. So I will start by turning it over to Vidya, who's going to go through the findings of the Close to Home report, and then Mishi will share some of the strategies states are using to leverage the report. So Vidya, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, everybody. It's really great to be here, and thanks to Allison and NJNN and to Mishi for having us on today to talk about our report that we recently released called Moving Beyond Youth Prisons: Lessons from New York City's Implementation of Close to Home. So just a quick note, the Columbia University Justice Lab, we are based at Columbia University, and we sort of serve as a action research think tank and do a lot of different types of projects. And this youth justice work, as Allison said, is really centered on ending youth prisons. And one of the things that we're doing within that portfolio of work is kind of developing knowledge and capacity around how to sort of deinstitutionalize systems. And so this is the first of hopefully a series of case studies really looking at how different places are going about this. And it was exciting to get to kind of focus on New York, given some of all the work that I've been involved in New York over the last 10 years. And this was an exciting opportunity to kind of get that down on paper. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to try to keep my remarks brief so we have a lot of time for Q&A. Great. So just to start off, the main takeaways in our report were really about how collaboration and trust really played a key role in terms of getting this initiative off the ground. There were a lot of different people involved, a lot of different players, both from the state level, from the local level, and from the ground, from communities and other folks who are serving to support this, whether it was advocates or young people and families and provider organizations. So it's important to kind of know that from the beginning, and we talk about that a lot in the report. Also, that Close to Home was really a fundamental reimagining of the system. It wasn't necessarily about sort of recreating what had been happening at the state level, which was sort of this approach that in many ways represents what had been done for decades of sending youth far away and having them be in these large, archaic kind of facilities away from their homes and communities, and then sort of returned. That Close to Home wasn't necessarily going to replicate that or have even the same number of beds. And so that kind of brings me to the last point, which is it was not about having this bed-to-bed transfer of a system that had been state-run and moving it to the city, but really about thinking through, like, where can we actually see these young people that is outside of a facility, and what can that look like on the ground? Just to give some background about New York pretty close to home. So really, New York was sort of mirroring many of the trends that were already happening in other places, which was that, after peaking in terms of how many kids were being locked up and just sort of being arrested and put behind bars, that number started dropping in the 90s in New York and elsewhere. And a lot of that locally in New York City was a result of some additional reforms that were also being put into place, which we don't outline here, but there was a lot going on locally in terms of detention reform and the introduction of a risk assessment instrument and development of some new alternatives to incarceration. And a lot of this had been done with the support of advocates locally. And, at the same time, there were just that kind of effort had sort of started to have placements drop in New York City, and that was true statewide. And there was a 56% decline in youth that were being admitted to state facilities in New York State between 2000 and 2008. And obviously, because New York City was such a big contributor to that number, they were among the sort of biggest in terms of the decline. But that said, the remaining admissions that were still entering the system were from New York City. And most of those beds where young people were being sent were still upstate. I think it was something like 88% of beds were upstate. And so this cartoon was something that ran in one of the local papers in the state, just around how this was sort of creating this perfect storm in terms of very few kids left in the system, but because the number of facilities and beds was still so high, that when that cost was being divided by kid, it was just a very high cost per kid, around $250,000 per young person. So now I'm going to kind of use that backdrop to kind of get into the lessons that we outline in the report of how this change kind of came about. And it, like I said, it wasn't just sort of one thing that started it. It was sort of a number of things that came into play. But essentially, the big first lesson was turning this crisis into opportunity. And a lot of the work that was happening in the mid-2000s and a little bit later were about sort of sounding the alarm about what was happening in facilities in New York State. There are a number of different reports issued that became very public and outlined some serious abuses, both by the Human Rights Watch and ACLU. There was an ongoing DOJ investigation that started in 2008. And then lastly, a task force that had come online in the late 2008 and sort of ran its course over the course of about a year in New York State. This was the Patterson Task Force that was chaired by the then president of John Jay College, Jeremy Travis. All of these reports basically outlined a very similar story of just, how the state was in crisis in terms of how it was treating young people in its care, and that there was this real moment to look at what was being done. And in partnership with many of the advocates that were in the state, these reports really got so much attention and became sort of front page news. And a lot of that was because at the time the state was working pretty closely with the advocates. This was under Commissioner Carrion, who was at the time the State Office of Children and Family Services Commissioner. And she was really invested in coming in and trying to reform what was happening and to shut down the prisons that existed. And so there was a clear discussion around how that could happen, and that she needed the advocates to sort of support that effort. And they were really active in that effort, both in terms of organizing others on the ground, but also to help kind of message what was happening. There was a strategic communications campaign that was in play that was called Empty Beds, Wasted Dollars, which was really about highlighting just how high the cost of sending a young person into facilities was. And that, by just sort of outlining that really clearly and making that argument, it started to really turn the political tide away from wanting to kind of keep these facilities in place. And it sort of created this political will, particularly starting in like 2009, 2010. Especially as the state was kind of in the middle of this terrible recession. The financial sector had collapsed in New York City in 2008, and just things were really dire. Between just seeing what was happening in these facilities from these reports, from knowing how high the cost was. And then in some cases, because many of these facilities had so few kids, there were like people were, both Mayor Bloomberg and Governor Cuomo went on different very highly public visits of empty facilities where staff were there, but there were no kids. And so it's just created this bad optics around why are we still doing this, and this is not something we need to continue. And it created the opening to sort of call for change, which is when Mayor Bloomberg sort of said, like, we're going to take our kids back and rethink our approach. And it set into motion an entire process at the city level to sort of plan a new system. And so basically that kind of moves us into lesson number 2, which is planning for that system and what that actually meant. And in New York and in New York City, a lot of that was centered around coming up with what a new vision for the system would look like. You know, if we're not going to sort of recreate what was happening at the state, and we knew we didn't really want that given the sort of bad outcomes and just the treatment of young people that was terrible. You know, what do we want? And it was an opportunity to ask that question. 2 different commissioners were sort of brought to help chair this new committee called the Dispositional Steering Reform Committee. That was the Department of Probation Commissioner, Vinnie Schiraldi, and ACS Commissioner at the time, Ron Richter. And together, along with a large group of different agency stakeholders and judges and advocates and providers all around the table, kind of really thinking about what this would look like. And part of that involved both touring different places, but part of that involved having a lot of questions about who should be in the system and why and for what, and what kinds of things do we need to have in communities to really support young people if we're not using facilities. And then when we do have any kind of facility, for the small numbers that we might have to still send out of home for some period of time, what would that look like and how would it be different than what we've been doing? So between all of those things, and we'll go to the next slide, you can kind of see that sort of set into motion this longer planning process. So that establishing a vision part, like I said, involved a lot of different stakeholders. It involved looking to other jurisdictions. You know, I think sometimes it's easy to assume that New Yorkers just think they know everything and they can do it because that's how they act. But in many ways, this was an opportunity to really learn about what other places had been doing and how to kind of take that and sort of imbue it into the work that they wanted to do. And not that anything was a perfect fit, but that it was more of an opportunity to see different things. And some of the places that stakeholders went were to Boston to see the ROCA program, which is really sort of centered on helping to engage young people through building really strong relationships and sort of never giving up on kids, and trying to do both kind of that intense mentoring and talking with young people, but also kind of supporting them with employment opportunities. And then the Missouri model was also a place that folks wanted to see just because it was so well known in the field as having a different approach to placement, and that many of those facilities were located directly in the neighborhoods, and repurposed many different buildings, like churches and schools, and just looked a lot different than sort of the typical facility that folks knew. And then lastly, Wayne County was an important influencer just in terms of, you know, they had dropped their state custody population from like 700 young people to 2, and a lot of that had been about sort of moving kids into more community-based settings and kind of rethinking what that looked like locally. And it gave a lot of credence to the idea that it could be done in New York as well. And once that was all sort of taken into account, there was also separately like an ongoing discussion around understanding who the population of young people in New York City was and what it is that they were coming in for and where they were going, and whether or not the reasons that young people were entering facilities actually were warranted, and like whether that could be scaled back in different ways, which eventually led to the creation of a decision-making grid that would sort of change how dispositions played out, and that would allow probation to kind of help guide judges' decisions, in terms of what was actually determining where they should go, whether they were high risk and medium risk and low risk, and what actually happened to those young people. And that was a really important step in the process, and that over time that was also going to be monitored to sort of ensure that folks were adhering to that sort of approach that had been discussed and agreed upon through this planning process. I'm laying out here, this slide just lays out some of the key questions I think that we've kind of gone over already, but fundamentally, these were some of the things that I think people really weighed in the process of the planning, and ultimately had a lot to do with why close to home sort of looked the way it did. But I think fundamentally that second question is a really key one, and that close to home was not just a residentially focused thing. It was very much about having more community alternatives and really being thoughtful about whether we needed as many beds as we had before, and that at the same time there would be all these different policies and practices to really support this different vision. And the picture here sort of highlights what facilities ended up looking like. ACS opted to contract with various providers and create its homes that way, as opposed to sort of building facilities. And a lot of that came down to just sort of space and time. Close to home, once legislation was passed in 2012, there was only about 5 months between when that legislation was passed in March and September when it actually took effect. And so there was a lot of work done beforehand, but this was a big piece of it, was getting those contractors to come on board and figuring out which facilities, which existing places could be refurbished and made into facilities for close to home. And part of this was that there was going to be sort of this discussion around whether providers actually would have the opportunity to reject youth in any way. In the past, that had been an issue, but moving forward, ACS had made rules around that there was no reject or no eject policy. So once a kid was sort of determined to be in placement and they were decided to be in a specific security level facility, that that was the facility they were going to be in, and providers needed to be able to handle them. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the training that went into that, but that was part of the policy when close to home was being developed. One of the things we didn't focus on yet, but part of this, to get to the numbers around who should be in the system, New York City engaged in this forecasting process that was really about figuring out who should and shouldn't be placed, and that was with support from the Casey Foundation and other providers, including Vera and John Jay College and the city. And this sort of was an important process, both in that it had to do with data, but a lot of it just had to do with sort of conversation and agreement among stakeholders about what was appropriate. Like, could we get away with sort of thinking about young people differently? Maybe not all of the offenses that we previously were thinking about really deserved, an out-of-home placement, and maybe other things, we have to be more thoughtful about. And eventually, even with all of those discussions and the numbers that had been forecasted, which were relatively low, the city still decided to sort of contract for more beds than it needed, in part because there was some of this fear around whether this was really going to be feasible. But thankfully, and over time, it became clear that those beds, that there were too many in the system, but thankfully, because they were procured and not built, it was much easier to shed those beds. There was sort of a provisions to kind of giving contract notice, but then they could be cut. So it was just an important lesson that was learned. It's important to really look at those numbers and think through them and be comfortable with them. Lesson number 3. So this is really about the sort of implementation and execution of close to home, which was, it was a big change and it required a lot of work. But ultimately, it was a good change. That said, there were only 5 months, again, in between when the legislation passed and when the first facilities had to come online. And so there were some pretty significant challenges in terms of staffing, and just making sure that all the providers that were now involved had all the right staff. But within ACS, there was a new division that had to be created to sort of oversee things that that was happening, that within probation, which had this new decision-making process, that everybody was aware of all the different pieces of that process and how it should look, and that all of the different stakeholders, including prosecutors and judges and public defenders, that all of those people had a good awareness of how this was going to go. And so that was a big part of the process for the first year, probably, and certainly for the first 6 months. And there was also just a recognition of the fact that in addition to the sort of initial startup training, that there was an ongoing need to sort of keep talking to people, and different agencies handled that in different ways. Some agencies had sort of ongoing booster trainings of its staff. That within ACS there were sort of discussions around convening the providers regularly, because they're sort of aiming for a Missouri-like approach, and they wanted to kind of make sure that people were able to maintain some fidelity to that approach. And so people were convened on a regular basis. But that said, there were definitely still challenges, and there was a need to respond to those challenges. So, from an agency perspective, that included just sort of being able to look at the data on a regular basis and to go out into the various boroughs and bring people together to talk through what they were seeing as far as trends, and make sure that those were being looked at and then addressed as needed. At one point at the very beginning, there were a lot of young people, because the first phase of bringing kids back to New York City involved these what are called non-secure facilities. There are a fair amount of kids that were running away from these facilities, and there were a high number of kids who were going absent without leave, or AWOLs. And so there were a lot of reports about this and some pretty troubling incidents in the community. And at some point, it could have been the end of Close to Home, because it was a pretty challenging time. But one of the things that was very notable in this process was that there was a commitment to sort of stay on top of those issues and to really work through them. And there was a citywide focus on it, and the mayor's office kind of convened a small group of stakeholders to help track this and really monitor what was happening and come up with a solution, which involved creating sort of a separate facility, tapping into one of the providers to create a separate facility for young people who might be experiencing some serious issues and might be then, riling up the others in the facility. And so there's an opportunity to take them out for a little while and then bring them back. And in some cases, they finished their time out in this other facility and it was no problem, or they had enough time away that when they returned, it was different. But in the end, that was like a solution that was partially driven by lots of different people coming to the table around that, and that everyone was sort of messaging the same thing, that they were going to get through this. And so that was really important. In terms of just the final lesson for this report, we sort of focus on some of the numbers that we had and the importance of tracking and reporting progress. Just a quick caveat, there was no sort of one overarching set of measures necessarily that kind of governed all of Close to Home. A lot of the data that we sort of found here is stuff that I think is important, and obviously we had some access to, but wasn't necessarily just sort of this set that had been agreed upon earlier. And I think that's something that we would recommend in future places that might take this on. So some of the key things here, placements in New York City started declining faster than the rest of the state between 2012 and 2016. And you can see it was a pretty significant decline in New York City. We know that the numbers have actually gone even further in New York City. It's something like 71% as of, I think, the end of 2018. So it's gone even lower. From a youth development lens, things were looking pretty good. Some notable things here that, at least in the 2016-2017 school year, 91% of those from Close to Home were passing their classes. 82% of these youth were being transitioned back to a parent or other family member or guardian, and that 9 out of 10 of these young people were transitioning back into community-based programming. So they were getting connected as they were coming out of facilities to some kind of pro-social activity. In terms of public safety, we don't have anything to sort of say that close to home actually caused this drop in terms of arrests, but it does sort of seem interesting to note that juvenile arrests were dropping faster in New York City than in the rest of the state during the period that close to home was implemented. So at the very least, we know it wasn't sort of having any negative impact. The overall decline in juvenile arrests had doubled after the enactment of close to home, so that was a pretty significant change. One area that sort of continues to be problematic is just that the racial disparities still persist despite those lower numbers. So 90% of close to home alternative to placement or residential admissions were youth of color, and for the kids who are in what's known as limited secure placement, which is a slight step up from the non-secure placement, 100% of those were youth of color. That said, in terms of overall numbers, when we got a one-day snapshot of young people in close to home, if something like 95 young people were in what's considered non-secure facility, and 12 were in locked custody under a limited secure facility, as of a count in mid-February. So that's pretty significant. So in terms of just final thoughts, I think one of the things that in sort of rethinking and rewriting some of this through the report is that it's really important to sort of be bold and be innovative, and that this moment of sort of having that crisis 10 years ago or more in New York City and New York, that they just don't come around every day. And it was a good chance to really rethink what was happening here. And a big part of that was collaborating and partnering with advocates and with communities. That said, this is an ongoing process, and the system is probably not done with changing. There's still stuff that's happening in New York City now, especially as Raise the Age is taking effect, and there's been a more concerted effort to even think about the different alternative programs that are coming online and what they look like and how we're partnering with young people, families. So it's never over, but it's important to sort of keep being able to have the mechanisms in place to keep evolving. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Vidya, for talking about the close to home model. And so I'm going to try to keep my remarks fairly short because I would love to have time for question and answer. And today I feel like I'm kind of wearing two hats. I'm the National Field Director at Youth First, and we are a national project that is partnering with folks in different states on campaigns to close youth prisons and invest in alternatives to incarceration. And so I feel like the Close to Home report is super helpful and relevant for the work that we are doing with our state partners. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I also, as you said, as Allison said in my intro, was working in New York City with Vinnie Schiraldi at Probation on the planning for close to home, and so was involved in the beginning stages around close to home. So also can speak to sort of like that piece as well. So I just wanted to really emphasize a few points that Vidya made that I think are so critical when we're talking about how this report could be helpful as we try to bring about sort of transformative change in the states that we're working in. And I think the main thing is that, like as Vidya said, the opportunity to really kind of rethink youth justice in a state doesn't come along that often. And so when you have that opportunity, I think it's really important to push states to be really, to really be willing to completely, start a new system from scratch. And I feel like that's in a way what Close to Home was. It was really starting a new system from scratch. And so a lot of times in states, when you talk about closing youth prisons, the response is, okay, we'll close large youth prisons, but we'll replace them with newer, nicer youth prisons that are closer to home. And that actually is not what the Close to Home initiative was about. And so I think it's a really good way to push back against people who say, okay, we will support closing. Like, for example, in Wisconsin, the governor and the legislature passed legislation to close the Lincoln Hills Youth Prison in Copper Lake, which is Lincoln Hills is the largest youth prison in the country. But their response is, we'll build smaller, newer prisons, which are still youth prisons. And so this Close to Home report is a way to try to change that conversation, to try to get policymakers and decision makers to think, can we do something completely different and have kind of a new vision? And so I feel like this report is a really helpful way to have that conversation with policymakers. And I think that, there's a few things about what happened with Close to Home that I think are really important to lift up. One is that Close to Home, as Vidya said, was not a bed transfer from the state to the city. It wasn't like, let's, since we're closing these state prisons, let's build new small youth prisons in New York City. It really was an opportunity to really look at the decision making that was driving who goes into youth prisons and who goes into residential placement, and how can we shrink that number. And so, as Vidya said, there was, like a process to do that analysis, but there was also a process to kind of look at, try to change the decision-making process. And so one of the things that so one of the things that with Close to Home, with the planning of it, was creating sort of the structured decision-making grid and looking at sort of decisions around, who are the young people being recommended for placement and how can we reduce that number. And so the structured decision-making grid was a way to look at, to make sure that these decisions are really being driven by public safety concerns and not because, young person might be high needs and might require a range of services, which is, in the past, a lot of times judges would be sending young people to placement because they feel like that's a place that young people could get mental health services or drug treatment services or whatever services that they need. And like the Close to Home was a way to sort of like push decision makers to say, no, like that's not the role of placement, and let's make sure that those programs and services are offered in the community. And so one of the other things I think it's really important with Close to Home, and we could really emphasize with our states now that are working towards transforming their system, is that Close to Home was also an opportunity to really expand the community-based alternatives to incarceration, expand the non-residential programming. And so, as Vidya said, New York City had created a range of programs before Close to Home was enacted, and that was really draining the flow of young people into state facilities. But the programming that was available, the alternative to incarceration programming, was pretty much, there was like a limited number of models. It was mostly multi-systemic therapy, family functional therapy. It was like these evidence-based models. And I remember Vinny Schiraldi saying, Eskimos might have 30 ways of saying snow, but it's all snow. And so that's kind of what we had in New York City before Close to Home, was all of these, these evidence-based programs that are very clinical and very sort of focused on providing sort of therapy to young people and their families. And there was a lot of young people who were in the system that didn't need therapy. And so the Close to Home, when Close to Home, or the community-based intervention committee and the planning of Close to Home really focused on how can we expand the range of community alternatives to include other types of alternative to incarceration interventions that aren't sort of family functional therapy or multisystemic therapy. And so a lot of the new programming was developed around sort of youth development principles, around connecting young people to opportunities, to skills building, to education. And so those were a lot of the new programs that Close to Home implemented. And then I think another really important piece, as we're talking about reform in our states, is holding up Close to Home as a fiscal realignment model, because what Close to Home did was, it was like a way to realign the money that was being used on youth incarceration, and be able to have New York City use that money differently. And so when the Close to Home legislation passed in 2012, New York City gave a block grant to New York City to create this new system in New York City. And that was really important because it gave New York City flexibility in terms of how they use that money. And so with that flexibility, New York City could say, okay, we're going to use some of this money to create these, close to home residential programs, but then we can use a lot of this money to expand our community-based alternatives. And as we further reduce the number of young people in residential, because as Vidya said, in the beginning they opened up too many beds, but as they shrank the number of kids in residential, they had the flexibility to take that money and reinvest it back into the community-based alternatives. And so it was really important to have that flexibility, and it created a further incentive for New York City to continue to shrink its population of kids in residential. And so that's something that when we're talking to our state partners now, we really emphasize the importance of to have that flexibility to not. So if the state is giving you money, it's giving a county money, a locality money, like for juvenile justice, to really push back and say, like, don't say that we have to use this money for facilities or for residential, that we should have the flexibility to invest that money into non-residential community alternatives. And the other thing I think is really important to hold up with a close to home model as we're trying to work for transformative change in our states, as Vidya said, is that the close to home model really wasn't about new construction. They contracted with nonprofit agencies to open residential buildings in communities, but for the most part, most of these buildings most of the residential programming that they opened were repurposed buildings. And so similar to Missouri, in New York City, a lot of the close to home facilities are like, or old Catholic schools or convents or, buildings that have been repurposed. And that's really important because these buildings are already part of the fabric of these neighborhoods. And so most close to home facilities, when you go visit them in New York City, you don't know there's a facility on the block because it's completely like they blend in with the neighborhoods. And so that's really important. So it's not like, as in some of the states we're working with, as states, as I mentioned, want to build nicer, newer youth prisons, they're looking for like 5 acres, 6 acres, and they're putting it off somewhere like not in the communities where young people live. And so it's a kind of replicating that prison model, but closer to home. And the close home facilities really were about like integrating the residential into existing neighborhoods. The other things I think that really important and we could sort of hold up when we talk about the close to home model is that education was a really critical piece of this. And so one of the things, one of the rationale for doing the close to home initiative was that what happened was when in New York, and this happens in many places, right? When young people were being sent from New York City to youth prisons upstate, they were being sent to facilities that were providing providing education that wasn't accredited. So the schools inside the state prisons actually weren't accredited schools. And so young people were going to going to class and having instruction and going to class for all day, and then after the release from prison, coming home and finding out that they weren't getting any academic credit for their work. Which was incredibly demoralizing for a young person who spent 2 years upstate and comes back and realizes they don't have any, they have no credits. And so a lot of them, understandably did not re-enroll back into school. And so with the close to home model, there really is a seamless education. And so that young people who are in the close to home facilities, the Department of Education, the New York City Department of Education runs the schools that young people are attending, and so that they get full credit for their work. And when they release, most of them go to New York City Department of Education schools, and so all of their credits are transferred. And I think this is really important, and I think it's also really important because for the young people, as Vidya mentioned, who are in the non-secure facilities, they actually all go to school. They do leave the building to be able to go to school in a Department of Education building where they're in school with other young people in non-secure programming and on the other non-secure programs. But I think it's important that they do leave the building to go to school, and that they're in, that's something that we're trying to emphasize with in our state campaigns, as trying to push back, is saying you don't need to have this model where kids have to go to school in the building, that they should be able to leave and go to school in the community or in another setting. So so when the when this close to home report was released, it actually was released in Milwaukee, which was very timely because, as I mentioned, Wisconsin is having these conversations right now about how to change their youth justice system. And so, as I mentioned, the legislature and the governor have signed legislation called Act 185 to close Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake. And now there's discussions in Milwaukee County and on the state around what should replace Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake. And so it was super helpful to have this report and to have Vinny and Vidya come to Milwaukee and talk about this model, because I think it has really forced the policymakers there to say, oh, wait a second, like, this is an opportunity for us to do something really different. Why are we trying to replicate a failed model? We know that youth prisons don't work. Why are we trying to build new youth prisons in Milwaukee County? Why can't we do something different? And so this report, I think, is already having an impact. And so I think, I really do encourage people to read the report, really think about how they could apply it to the work that they're doing to try to push reform push reform in the states that you're working in. And I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure that we have time for questions.
I don't have any recent information on alternatives to detention, and I'm not entirely sure what is meant by shifted to scaffold use, but if it means just sort of how youth are sort of typically moved based on how they're scoring on a risk assessment instrument. I mean, there's a risk assessment instrument in place in New York City, and for youth who are scoring low, they're typically released. They're not held in any kind of pretrial detention, but might be, called back in for their court appearances. For mid-risk youth, they go to alternative to detention programming, and there's a range of providers in New York City that are contracted by the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, and they're in all 5 boroughs, and their sort of main focus is on kind of helping to ensure that kids appear in court when they're supposed to. And a lot of it is the sort of after-school programming, and it's light in terms of what it's supposed to do and how long kids are in it. I think it's like a max, maybe 120 days. It might be, and I think it's shorter term initially. And then high-risk youth are the ones that are potentially ones that would actually end up in detention. So I think that's what's meant by the question. I don't have any actual data on that since I haven't been involved in it in a while, but that's how it typically works.
And also, too, I know that question was from Eric Rivera. If you need further clarification, please feel free to type it in. I'm going to move us through some other questions because we do have a number of folks who submitted questions. But the next one's from Chris Arroyo, and so I apologize. The question is, what are the policies that can intertwine with the Close to Home report in which New York policymakers or organizers themselves should focus on that you would like to see uplifted?
Yeah, I think one of those policies was the one that I mentioned around the no reject, no eject policy. I think, one of the things that was happening pre-close to home in New York City was there was a bit of a convoluted dispositional process, but often, private providers were sort of having first dibs on young people who were going through the system and were, thinking about what should happen with them, and they would kind of go through this interview process in some cases. It was very strange, and then they would get selected by the program, replete with like an acceptance letter and stuff. So it almost felt like they were doing something great when in the reality was they were going to a facility. And only after that were alternatives being even considered. So it was a crazy sort of process. That said, once that was all being addressed through the legislation, a lot of that centered around, rethinking this dispositional process and introducing the structured decision-making grid that he was referring to. And then on the provider side, this notion of once a placement decision was made by a judge at ACS, which is the agency that really oversaw the residential, had the ability to both figure out like where that young person was actually going to be placed in terms of a provider, And those providers had strict no reject, no eject policies in place, so they couldn't just sort of decide which kid they were going to take or not. It was really about being able to work with every kid and getting some ongoing coaching and sort of monitoring from ACS. So I think that was like at least one of those policies that I would highlight. Mishi, do you have other ones you might mention?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this the piece around sort of changing the incentives and changing the fiscal incentives, I think is really important. So like one of the things that New York did, I mentioned like the flexibility and funding really helped incentivize like further expanding community-based alternatives because New York City was able to use that money to do that. They weren't beholden to like using that money for, for either, new construction or youth prisons. And that's how it's kind of playing out in some states now where they're saying you have to use, like in Wisconsin, you have to use this Act 185 money to build new facilities. So that was really important. But the fiscal incentive piece, I think that one thing that needs to further happen is that money, in terms of reinvestment, really needs to be about not just being able to reinvest it into interventions for young people who are currently in the youth justice system, but that money should really go to like larger community investment into the communities that have been most impacted by youth incarceration. So like, I think one of the things that we know is that young people need positive relationships and connections, like all up until, they need those relationships until adulthood. And so even after they're finished with the disposition of their case, there should be funding in communities for young people to have like, mentors and have positive relationships, and not like mandated programming, but programs that young people want to be in so that they have the supports that they need in the communities where they live. And so I feel like with the fiscal incentives and the reinvestment, that's like another piece, is to make sure that community investment really is really about building up neighborhoods and capacity neighborhoods to care for young people, all young people in their communities. And then also I think that, one thing that we mentioned, which I think is really important that should be lifted up, is with the residential, like, like as Vidya said, originally like New York had too many beds, but because they contracted and they had very small residential programs, like most of the residential programs are like 8 beds or, like 8 to 10 beds, like because they're so small, that gives the, again, that flexibility to just like take those beds offline and to, end those contracts and shrink the number of, the number of residential beds. And so I think like small is good for a lot of different reasons. I think it's more home-like to have young people in small. I mean, we want young people to be in home in their communities, but if they're going to be in a residential setting, to have it small, I think is important because you can have a more home-like setting, but then also it gives you the flexibility to reduce beds and just take those beds offline.
Great, thanks guys. The next question is whether you guys received pushback from the community, and if so, how did you guys address it, or how did it get addressed during the process?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, there were definitely processes to sort of gather community input, particularly on the siting of these facilities, but also to kind of gather community and youth sort of input on programming too. I know there were things that were happening internally at probation, which was housing many of the alternative programs, to kind of figure out what young people and families wanted to sort of see in terms of what options would be available. That said, like on the facility side, there was some pushback in these different meetings. I wouldn't, the way that from what we heard and learned through the interview process, it was not as like intense as maybe one might have imagined. There were some things that were put into the legislation that were kind of helped get around some of the typical land use processes that may have helped alleviate some of that, which was, there was a special thing that allowed close to home to kind of get a waiver for some of the typical processes and acquire things quickly. And that was an important piece of this process. But there were several different community meetings in various boroughs, and some of them were probably more heated than others. But on the whole, I think once the facilities were actually online and once some of the initial issues had started to sort of die down, my sense is that close to home, like Mishi was saying, many of those facilities are facilities that people don't even realize are necessarily there, just given how they look and feel. And I think for the most part, now 5-6 years down the road, like things have settled into sort of a more typical pattern of how these places are working with the young people.
Thank you. And we do actually have way more questions than we have time for, so we'll do our best to catalog all the questions that we've received and make sure to get responses for folks. But I did want to ask or try to combine a bunch of questions that we received around what secure and non-secure facilities actually look like and what those programming options might be. So there's a few different questions around programming and whether therapeutic foster care or long-term treatment placements were available, and then there's some questions on what secure and non-secure facilities actually look like. So I don't know if either of you can speak to that, but I know there was a handful of questions.
Yeah, I mean, actually, just so folks know, within the report, there is like a section where we kind of detail some of that more clearly. So I would encourage people to read that. And I don't know, Mishi, if you want to talk about any of this specifically. I mean, so it's limited secure is the more secure version, just so folks know. And those probably have a slightly more institutional feel and have different security mechanisms that make them look different. But the non-secure facilities, I think, are much more home-like on the inside. And, I haven't been to one recently, so I don't have a good handle on it. But I don't know, Mishi, if you want to talk about some of this.
Yeah, I mean, so like the non-secure facilities, they definitely they don't feel like prisons. And like I said, they're very small, like 8 to, I don't know, like, was it 12 or 15 beds maybe is the max for the limit for the non-secure. And there's a lot of training for staff in adolescent development, in youth development. They actually, as Vidya mentioned, New York looked to Missouri when they were implementing this, because Missouri was really the only place that had tried to really change the culture inside their residential facilities and had created, what people refer to as the Missouri model. And so Missouri Youth Services Institute, and some of I don't think all the facilities use the Missouri model, but the ones that do, they have the Missouri Youth Services Institute working with the staff on like ongoing training and coaching. So there's a lot of coaching for staff on working with young people and using sort of like a positive youth development approach. And just give you one sort of story, which I feel like it really speaks to like the staff and the like how they do really try to take on a different approach, is that I visited a close to home facility in Brooklyn recently where they actually were very honest with us, and maybe I shouldn't say this on a webinar, but they were very honest with us that they broke like the ACS regulations on a regular basis, because ACS, I think, had told the staff that once a young person leaves the facilities, that they're not supposed to maintain contact with that young person, because there's another group responsible for aftercare and for like but what the staff told us was like, those young people, we've developed really positive relationships with those young people, and so we've become mentors to them and moral, emotional support. And so if they reach out to us, we're not going to say we can't maintain contact with you. And so I think that really spoke to like the fact that the staff really understand the importance of positive relationships in these young people's lives. And so you do feel like that sort of, there is a lot of work around creating that positive culture. And the young people do leave, as I mentioned, to go to school, which I think is important. So they're not in the building 24/7. And so in the non-secure facilities, at least. So it definitely, and the other thing I think that's important is that this ACS has made a real effort to like really reduce length of stay. So I think for most young people, they don't stay more than like 6 or 7 months. I think that's the longest that most young people will stay in a closed down facility. So I think that's also important, that recognize that that we shouldn't be keeping young people, the residential should be a last resort, but if they're going to be in residential, it should not be for a long period of time.
Thank you, guys. And I know it's a little past 4, so we'll go ahead and close out. Like I said, we will do our best to get the questions over to the presenters and get responses for folks. I know there were a handful of questions about where they could access the report and whether the PowerPoint will be made available. We'll be sure to get a copy of the PowerPoint and email it out with the webinar recording. And just so folks know, both the executive summary and the full report are listed as handouts in this webinar, but we will also include a link to the Columbia University's Justice Labs webpage, which has links to both of those, or the executive summary and the full report, when we follow up around this webinar. So we'll be sure to get all that information to you and do our best to answer questions. And we'll also provide information for the speakers so that if there's additional questions, we can you can follow up with them individually. So I appreciate everybody for sticking it out with us, and apologize for the technical glitches there. But thank you, and we will be in touch with the resources and follow-up materials. I hope everyone has a good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.